Good morning, La. Your Excellency Ambassador Dashu Sonam Topge, distinguished guests, online viewers, and ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to the thematic area 6 on the topic governance, public policy, and leadership. In this session, we'll explore how governance, policy, and leadership shape sustainable development and societal well-being in Bhutan. The sessions will examine corporate social responsibility, education financing, post-pandemic workplace culture and evaluation frameworks, and highlight strategies to strengthen institutional effectiveness, promote inclusive decision-making, and foster resilience. The session will also emphasize evidence-based decision-making and approaches for informed policy-making and transformative leadership. For this session, we are honored to have on the keynote address Dashu Thong Rinzin, Vice Chancellor of the Royal University of Bhutan. Dashu Thong has previously served as the Director of the Royal Institute for Governance and Strategic Study, or the RIGS, and as Deputy Chamberlain to His Majesty the King. He began his career as an engineer at the Bhutan Standards Bureau, serving for 11 years and contributing as a core member to Bhutan's accession negotiations at the World Trade Organization. Dashu Thong holds a bachelor's in electrical and electronics engineering from the University of Kerala, India, and a master's in public administration from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Let's welcome Dashu to speak on his topic, Bridging Governance, Policy, and Leadership Through Higher Education and Research.
Good morning, everyone. We have had 2 amazing days of the Australia-Bhutan Research Conference, and I'm sure everyone is eagerly looking forward to the deliberations on the 3rd and final day of the conference. Honorable Dashos, distinguished guests, scholars, researchers, students, and my dear friends, a very good morning to all of you. I'm happy to share a few thoughts on this important thematic session on governance, public policy, and leadership, particularly through the lens of how higher education and research can and must contribute to bridging and enhancing these critical aspects of nation building. We gather at a moment in history when expectations on governments, institutions, and leaders are rising at an unprecedented pace. Of course, governance, as we know, is a broad term, and it is not just about governments governing a country, but rather refers to the processes, structures, and institutions through which authority is exercised and decisions are made in governments, organizations, and other entities. So we have, for example, corporate governance, university governance, or governance of private companies, etc. The world is being reshaped by artificial intelligence, rapid technological advances, climate pressures, demographic transitions, and shifting geopolitical realities. In such a world, the premium on good governance, or as His Majesty would put it, intelligent governance, data-driven public policy, evidence-based decision-making, and ethical and adaptive leadership has never been higher. In the age of AI and digital transformation, decision-making that relies on intuition alone, as we know, is no longer adequate. Citizens today demand evidence, transparency, speed, and accountability. Development challenges from climate vulnerability to youth unemployment and migration, digital disruption, and rural-urban divides require coordinated, multi-sectoral, and well-informed responses. governments must leverage knowledge, data, and research at every step. Across the world, countries that effectively harness research and expertise in their decision-making are demonstrating remarkable resilience. Finland's education research policy ecosystem, Singapore's whole-of-nation strategy, the UK's tradition of independent policy think tanks, and Australia's Australia's strong university government partnerships all demonstrate a fundamental truth. Countries that invest in knowledge builds a future of stability, innovation, and progress. Reports indicate that in most OECD countries, governments allocate more grants that focus on research and specific analysis that is aimed at improving institutional structure and research. Bhutan too is entering a new chapter, one shaped by the National Transformation Agenda, civil service reform, education reform, and the emergence of technologies that will profoundly influence our society. This moment calls for leadership that is not only competent, but visionary, agile, curious, and collaborative, as His Majesty the King often emphasizes. Around the world, universities are not merely teaching institutions offering academic degrees. They are indeed the intellectual infrastructure of a nation, central to shaping governance, policy, and leadership in a fundamental and continuous manner. For example, the Royal University of Bhutan has close to 10,000 students. These students, many of whom are also sitting here with us today, they are the future leaders of Bhutan. Whether they become public servants, entrepreneurs, teachers, engineers, social workers, or researchers, they will influence policy and shape governance in countless ways. That is why our responsibility as a university is profound. Leadership development does not happen by accident, nor can it be done in the short haul. It happens through the cultivation of the right values such as integrity, responsibility, empathy, resilience, etc. Through the development of 21st century competencies such as critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, communication, collaboration, and so on. And through developing the right mindsets such as curiosity, lifelong learning, openness to diverse perspectives, and the courage to question and innovate. And the university is the right place for this holistic development of leadership over the long haul. Every classroom in the Royal University, or for that matter in any university in the world, should be a leadership incubator. Every faculty member is not just an academic, but a mentor shaping the next generation of Bhutanese leaders. Yesterday, during the fireside chat on AI and the future of higher education, we were listening to how teachers must play an increasing role not only to provide academic content, but more importantly on the holistic development of students with the right values and mindsets in an era increasingly dominated by technologies including artificial intelligence. We must align and adapt our curricula in response to the growing needs and challenges of our times so that we stay relevant and useful at all times. Research sits at the very heart of good governance. No policy can be truly effective unless it is grounded in evidence, informed by rigorous analysis, and shaped by a deep understanding of local realities. Universities have the unique ability to generate this knowledge. Through impact assessments, policy evaluations, and the generation of localized, context-specific data, we help governments and institutions understand what is working and what is not and what needs to change. By producing policy briefs, white papers, and expert analysis, universities illuminate pathways forward. offering analytical tools, scenario mapping, and forecasting that help leaders make informed, future-oriented decisions. We document emerging social, economic, environmental, and technological trends long before they appear on the desks of policymakers, helping the nation anticipate rather than react. Around the world, the most effective public policies are strengthened by the intellectual power of universities. Australia's Productivity Commission draws heavily on university research. New Zealand's social sector reforms rely on decades of academic evaluation. East Asian economic transformation models are deeply intertwined with university-based research, embedded at every level of national planning. Bhutan, too, stands to benefit immensely from this model, especially now as we navigate one of the most ambitious and far-reaching transformations in our country's history. While offering high-quality academic degrees remains our core mandate and an indispensable service to the nation, it can no longer be our only contribution. Bhutan cannot afford a university that stands by passively, delivering qualifications while watching the country transform from a distance. We must be an active engine of ideas, solutions, and innovation. We must step forward as thought leaders, shaping strategic national conversations with courage, depth, and clarity. There was acknowledgement from our own university researchers during this conference that while RUB conducts numerous researches, their influence on policy and innovation remains to be questioned. Therefore, the Royal University of Bhutan must generate research that responds directly to national priorities and not only for academic purposes. This requires us to work more deliberately with ministries, Dzongkhaks, corporations, CSOs, and communities, ensuring that our policies, programs, and reforms are informed by real data, real experiences, and real needs. Our role is not limited to academic inquiry. It extends to supporting governance systems through analytical insights and applied research, helping the nation design reforms that are evidence-based, pragmatic, and forward-looking. In this effort, we must embrace what many nations now recognize as the quadruple helix model, a dynamic framework in which universities, government, industry, and civil society work together to drive innovation, resilience, and national progress. The need for a stronger quadruple helix strategy in synergy in Bhutan was also emphasized during the fireside chat on bridging research, innovation, and policy on day one of this conference. Around the world, countries that have transformed their economics have done so not through isolated institutions, but through this inclusive and synergistic partnership. Governments create enabling conditions, industries bring real-world challenges and innovation opportunities, universities contribute research, talent, and thought leadership, and communities provide the lived experiences, cultural wisdom, and public insight that ensure solutions are meaningful and grounded. Bhutan, too, stands to benefit immensely from this model. By strengthening this four-way collaboration, we can accelerate solutions, elevate policy effectiveness, and ensure that national initiatives are both scientifically sound and socially responsive, aligning with the vision of His Majesty, the King, and the aspirations of the Bhutanese people. And above all, we must nurture a generation of leaders, ethical, competent, curious, digitally fluent, entrepreneurial, and globally aware, who will guide Bhutan through the complexities of a rapidly changing world. This leadership development is not an accessory to our mission. It is rather central to it. Every classroom, every research project, every mentorship interaction is shaping the future stewards of Bhutan's governance, economy, and society. In short, the RUB must position itself at the forefront of the ongoing national transformation, not at the periphery and not certainly a distant observer. We must be a driving force, an institution that brings value, relevance, and intellectual leadership to the country's transformation journey. As a public university, the RUB receives generous financial support from the government. Yet, as Bhutan's aspirations and expectations from the university expand, so too must the university's capacity. If RUB is to stand at the forefront of the national transformation, especially in the realm of research and innovation, our national investment in higher education must also evolve. Universities possess immense intellectual capital, but this expertise must intentionally be engaged and adequately resourced. Government ministries, corporations, CSOs, and local governments can draw far more purposefully from the university's research strengths, technical skills, and disciplinary knowledge. In return, they can empower us through research grants and long-term funding commitments, commission studies that address real policy and operational needs, collaborative projects with full access to relevant data, scholarships, internships, and problem-based learning opportunities, clearly articulated national challenges that allow our students and faculty to generate practical solutions. Such an approach creates a powerful virtuous cycle. The nation gains from rigorous evidence-based decision-making. The university strengthens its research ecosystem, academic excellence, and relevance. And together, we accelerate Bhutan's development in ways that are thoughtful, innovative, and future-ready as envisioned by His Majesty the King. As we look toward the future, the message is clear. Good governance requires good data. Good policy requires good research. And good leadership requires good education. National transformation, however, demands more than individual effort. It calls for all of us, governments, universities, industries, and civil society, working in close collaboration with clarity of purpose and a shared sense of direction. The Royal University of Bhutan stands ready to contribute to this collective journey, not merely as a provider of academic degrees, but as an active and reliable partner, a generator of new knowledge, a cultivator of future leaders, and a driver of sustainable national progress. In a few moments, we will hear 4 presentations that will explore these very themes in depth: the role of corporate social responsibility in achieving the SDGs in Bhutan, financing and governance challenges in primary education, reimagining post-pandemic work culture to support psychological well-being, and the emergence of evaluation ecosystem in Bhutan. I anticipate that these presentations will shed further light on the ideas I have shared above, providing practical insights and innovative perspectives that can guide us in strengthening governance, shaping public policy, and nurturing leadership across the country. Thank you, and Tash Dilil.
Thank you, Dashu, for your very illuminating wisdom on enlightened leadership and for the role of educational institutions to be leader incubators and the need and the agility of our educational institutions to anticipate change and to offer solutions as active engines within the community, within the quadruple helix model, and for us to be future ready and to anticipate new changes as we stride forward. So on this very powerful keynote, We would like to open this thematic session and to invite the first of our 4 speakers. We have Dr. Diki Chodan, lecturer in management at the School of Business and Law in Edith Cowan University, Australia. Dr. Diki is an earlier career researcher focusing on corporate social responsibility, sustainability, HRM leadership, and the SDGs. Dr. Diki is a member of the Center of Sustainability and Governance Research at ECU. With over 15 years of leadership in banking and finance sector and a strong academic background in business management, she brings a unique blend of industry and academic experience driven by her passion for innovation, sustainability, and bridging research with real-world practice. Let's welcome Diki to speak on a topic, the role of CSR in achieving SDGs, a key study from Bhutan.
Hello. A very good morning and Kuzangpola. The paper that I'm going to present today is a book chapter that I've written, for the book titled The Sustainable Development Goals and the Business Sector, Trends and Implementation Challenges. The objective of the book is to provide new perspectives on the critical role of businesses in addressing the SDGs. It will contribute to the current body of knowledge that brings together diverse perspectives and novel research investigating the business sector, how business sector is engaging and contributing to achieving the SDGs. My paper brings in the perspectives from Bhutan. The book is in its final production stage, and hopefully it will be published early next year. My presentation today will be presented in this 3 section of what, why, and how. The what section will discuss about what the study investigated. Why is about the significance and importance of the study, and how is the methodology of the study, how I conducted this research. I'll be briefly presenting on the key findings, discussion, limitation, and future research. Let's begin with what. So this study investigated how companies in Bhutan, large companies, particularly Druk Holding and Investment, and its 23 associated companies, contribute to sustainable development goals through their corporate social responsibility initiative. The study also investigated how this initiative aligned with the legitimacy theory. The research objectives were to identify which SDG were most supported by CSR, critically assess how current laws, policies, and strategies support or guide Bhutanese companies to contribute to the SDGs, and also analyze the underlying reason for the limited engagement of CSR with the SDGs. I'd like to share a little bit of context. It will be presented in these 4 subtopics, as you can see here on the slide. The first one is Bhutan's approach to CSR. Bhutan's commitment to CSR is aligned with the 5-year plan, which is guided by the development philosophy of gross national happiness. GNH aligns well with SDG, therefore implementing SDG in the 5-year plan was not challenging. Bhutan is also one of the first countries to begin early implementation of SDG since its adoption in the year 2015, and Bhutan is among the 44 countries that presented the first and subsequent report, the National Voluntary Review Report. As per the SDG report 2024, Bhutan has achieved a SDG index score of 72.5%, ranking 61 out of 166 country. Altogether, this indicates in terms of how proactive and supportive Bhutan has been in supporting the SDG initiative. Oh, sorry. I'd like to share a little bit on the CSR in Bhutan. The CSR in Bhutan is a regulatory requirement, and it is mandated by two important regulations, the Companies Act of 2016 and DHI CSR Guidelines of 2013. A brief information on DHI. This is where I've collected my data from. So DHI is the commercial arm of the government, and it operates in various sectors, such as energy and natural resources, financial services, transportation and communication, trading, and real estate. As of, in the year 2022, DHI contributed a sum of 15 million to the national revenue, and it aspires to cover the government expenditure by the full expenditure of the government by 2030, which is projected at 57.4 billion. We'll now go to the next section, that is the why part of my presentation, where I will discuss about why the study matters and the research significance. The study is important mainly for three reasons. Number one, global momentum on CSR requires corporate participation. Bhutan's CSR context is unique. It's unique because Bhutan's, the CSR is a regulatory requirement, and also because it's influenced from Bhutan's culture of compassion and community support. The research significance can be discussed under three aspects. The first one is the theoretical significance. So this study extends the legitimacy theory in a non-Western context and a culturally rooted context. On the practical significance, the study offers insights to managers and policymakers to enhance CSR effectiveness. And on the policy significance, the study informs CSR governance in the evolving business landscape of Bhutan. And lastly, the study also positioned Bhutan as a compelling case study for any other developing nation that aspires to enhance the sustainability, corporate sustainability initiative. I'll now briefly present on the methodology of the study, how I conducted the study. So the study employed a qualitative and exploratory research design. It used the 17 SDGs as a disclosure checklist and content analysis as the primary method. The study was conducted for DHI and its 23 associated companies. We analyzed the annual reports for 8 consecutive years, 2016 to 2023, and in total, 111 annual reports were analyzed. The content analysis was used to identify CSR initiative and match it with the 17 SDGs. The entire process was manual to ensure contextual accuracy, and the analysis was grounded in legitimacy theory, distinguishing between symbolic and substantive legitimacy. I'll now share the findings of the study under these two themes, CSR activities that support the SDGs and nature of the CSR initiative. The results suggest that Bhutanese companies are contributing to all the SDGs except for SDG 2 on zero hunger, SDG 7 on affordable and clean energy, and SDG 14 on life below water. The most supported SDG was SDG 16, that is peace, justice, and strong institution. The high contribution towards SDG 16 is mainly from donation and charity to religious events and NGOs. And one of the main reasons for donation and charity is again because of the Bhutanese culture of compassion and community support. Additionally, as per the DHI CSR guidelines, companies can perform CSR initiatives under the category of charitable contributions. The next supported SDG is SDG 3, that is good health and well-being. The high contribution to SDG 3 highlight how Bhutan prioritizes a healthy and caring society. Bhutan mandates free access to public health for all Bhutanese. Therefore, making contribution to SDG 3 is one of the most appropriate contribution to community building. Further, the other reason for the high contribution to SDG 3 is because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of the companies had contributed their CSR budget to the National COVID Relief Fund, especially for the year 2020 and 2021. And it was the next supported SDGs are SDG 4, 8, 13, and 1. The nature of these CSR initiatives are philanthropic and culturally motivated and not strategic. Some examples of symbolic CSRs were the housing project of SGCBL and the football tournament sponsored by the Bank of Bhutan. The study also found out that there are some signs of substantive CSR activities, and a very good example is the CSR initiative of Bhutan National Bank. The bank allocates dedicated CSR budget and also partners with NGOs to support their CSR initiatives. Moving on, I now have the discussion. So the discussion is discussed under the symbolic and substantive CSR. There's a predominance of symbolic legitimacy. CSR actions lack strategic depth. There's limited alignment with SDGs and GNH in the reporting because most of the annual reports did not even mention these terms. CSR is guided more by cultural norms than the formal policies. The implications will be discussed under the three aspects: theoretical, managerial, and policy. Under the theoretical implication, the study extends legitimacy theory in the Bhutanese context and also suggests that legitimacy theory is shaped by both regulation and culture. Under the managerial implication, there is a shift needed from random acts of charity to strategic CSR, to develop formal CSR integrating Bhutanese tradition, including SDGs and GNH values, to establish partnership with NGOs and community for a sustainable impact, and also to increase CSR reporting and dedicate CSR budgets. Under the policy implication, to strengthen the CSR regulation under the Companies Act, and also to ensure that all DHI companies implement the CSR. Yes, the study has some limitation. The limitations are limited database, subjectivity in content analysis, and CSR was viewed in isolation. And I also have some future research direction. Future researcher could expand the database by including non-DHI and private companies, also maybe adopt mixed methods, investigate the drivers of CSR adoption, and also use alternative theories such as stakeholder theory and institutional theory. And I would like to conclude my presentation by stating that Bhutanese companies are engaging in CSR, but SDG alignment is often symbolic. CSR is shaped by culture and regulation more than strategy. There is emerging signs of substantive CSR, and lastly, a strategic, transparent, and regulated CSR approach will help Bhutan better leverage corporate contributions to sustainable development. Before I leave from the stage, I would like to thank the three organizers, RUB, the Bhutanese Embassy in Canberra, and the DFAT for organizing this wonderful conference and giving me the opportunity to present, and mainly because I could bring this work home. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dickey, for highlighting findings which show that while Bhutanese firms engage in CSR, these are often philanthropic and culturally driven rather than strategically aligned with long-term SDG impact, and then the need for structured, context-sensitive CSR policies that balance tradition with sustainable development objectives. And following Dr. Dickey, we now have Dr. Gembut Sringh. Assistant Professor Dr. Gembut Sringh is a Nuffic and La Trobe IPRS and PG Fellow and serves as an Assistant Professor at the Paro College of Education, Royal University of Bhutan. His research areas encompass teacher education, international comparative education, educational evaluation and assessment, and primary education systems. Dr. Gembu is also actively engaged in international projects, including the Erasmus Plus program and Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge, and Innovation Exchange. Please welcome Dr. Gembu to speak on his topic, Financing and Governance of Primary Education in Bhutan, Challenges, Gaps, and Policy Implications.
Very good morning. My presentation today is on funding and governance of primary education in Bhutan. So let me get used to with this, okay? Thank you. The background and the context that I used for carrying out this study are as follows. So primary education serves as a foundational element shaping equity and quality. Bhutan prioritizes equitable access through centralized funding and local governance. And funding and governance significantly impact educational outcomes and equitable access to learning opportunities. And to illustrate this, I tried to have some diagrams this way to show the importance of the funding. And then based on those three broad overarching background points, I have set a couple of objectives. Number one is about to analyze funding mechanisms in Bhutan's primary education. Objective number two is to examine primary education governance structures and effects on educational outcomes. Then based on those two objectives, this is the research question that I have set for this study. And the significance of the study when if after completing these two objectives, I expect to provide insights for transparent, inclusive, and equitable policy reforms at primary education level in Bhutan. So the theoretical framework, as said earlier, I looked at two broad dimensions. One is school funding approaches, then the governance and administration of primary education in Bhutan. The assumption is that if these two elements are taken care, that will bring up learning outcomes. So under the school funding approaches, these are some of the assumptions that came from the literature review. School funding directly influences the quality, equity, and effectiveness of education systems. Sorry, I moved. Then school-based expenditure, funding models, and budgets vary significantly across countries and educational institutions. Adequate and equitable funding is closely associated with enhanced student outcomes. Then comparative models such as those in Australia, England, and the United States demonstrate the significance of formulas, weighted student funding, and contextual variables in achieving equity. Under the governance model, this is from the available literature in Bhutan based on how schools are governed. So governance establishes the framework for decision making, accountability, transparency, and adherence to established standards, whereas administration encompasses the planning, budgeting, staffing, curriculum development, and leadership practices that contribute to the overall efficiency of the system. Then there is another dimension, that is control mechanisms, such as inspections, accreditation, and monitoring to ensure compliance with regulations and maintain the quality of educational services. Then primary education systems and dedicated divisions also play a crucial role in aligning curriculum, teacher training, and early learning priorities to achieve the desired learning outcomes. So based on this framework, I identified some of the research gaps. So limited analysis of funding adequacy and distribution in primary education. Then insufficient evidence on impact of funding models on educational outcomes. And insufficient evidence on comprehensive understanding of governance, administration, and control mechanisms. And then limited research on dedicated divisions and their effects on primary education quality. So, yeah. Okay, that's the 4 gaps that I could identify. And then we have this one. So to study those gaps, I used this mixed methods convergent parallel design. So the quantitative data came from the documents that are available and the statistics provided by the Ministry of Education for public consumption. Likewise, the qualitative data also came out from the documents provided by the Ministry of Education for public consumption. Initially, the plan was to actually conduct a survey and also a direct interview with the stakeholders, but for some reasons, the access the data sources was a challenge, so I had to resort to these 2 mechanisms. So now the results and funding. So about the funding model, the Ministry of Education and Skills Development allocates budgets with Zongkhak level disbursements. Then the government serves as the primary funder. Minor parental contributions are made through the School Development Fund. Then private school funding is also there, and field-initiated funding are also came out from the documents. If we look at the forms provided by the Ministry of Education and Skills Development to the schools for preparing their yearly budget, this is the template that they circulate. Looking closely at this template, it is quite clear that some important things are missing there. We will come back to that soon. These are the variables they use. So, and then this came out from that book published by the Ministry of Education, General Guidelines for School Management. Now in other countries, as I mentioned earlier, they use these variables like school size, school location, low socioeconomic disadvantages or advantages, students with special needs, then English language proficiency. This is especially from one of the provinces in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. So they put in these variables for budgeting. But as we look at the form that was projected earlier, we don't see these kind of variables coming in. And then this has big implications. So if we look at this, we have I tried to correlate the different variables that are used available in the annual educational statistics books that the Ministry of Education and Skills Development publishes yearly, on an yearly basis. And I could not find a clear pattern to describe the budget allocation that is followed by the Ministry of Education. So weak correlation between budgets and student population. Assuming that school size is the primary variable that is used in allocating the budget, that too is not coming clearly, and then the budget is complex budget allocation. It is in fact a black box, very difficult to follow through. And there is disparities in funding. And then not being satisfied with that, I went down to the school level and also the budget amount allocated to each school, and then ranked the student number with the budget amount allocated, and then again I could not see a clear pattern there. What mechanism is used, both for capital and for current budget expenditure. So disparities between funding allocation and student population, complex funding approach, challenging to identify funding models from the data, and then what is not coming clearly is like legacy or historical trend-based funding models seem to have been followed in allocating the model budgets, because if we compare yearly trend comparisons, then it comes up that some percentages are constantly increasing based on years, number of years. And this statistics I pulled out from this book, Annual Education Statistics 2022. And now 2024, I think, is available. And the governance model, the Ministry of Education and Skills Development is responsible for formulating policies, facilitating teacher development. This is what this book has to say about the governance model. And district education officers oversee the local implementation and monitoring of these policies. School management boards play a crucial role in fostering community, Oh, these are the charts I have. Yeah. So this, so I looked at these documents to summarize their assumptions behind the governance and administration, sorry. Okay, if we look at now the discussion, if we look at, it came out in the Council just as recently as on 3rd December, that MPs demand open debate on education quality and budget allocation. So I thought it was actually true that I could not access the information sources, even when the MPs who are supposed to be having 100% access to the fund that goes to their schools in their constituencies are fighting for the transparency. So there is a big problem there. And now the interpretation of the results. So funding models complexity remains transparency and equity. A dedicated division for primary education governance enhances the relevance of educational inputs and processes and outcomes. Community engagement supports governance accountability. Legacy or historical trend-based funding models fall short in addressing the distinct needs of schools. And this graph is from the OECD. If you look at, there is a constant increase in the score points based on the amount of money that is put in, and after some time the outcome remains constant irrespective of how much money is gone. And if you look at the R squared, the variables explained is also much higher than the variables explained when the funding has exceeded that threshold. So if the variable-based funding model is followed, the variables come with thresholds, and then when the thresholds are not met or is going below thresholds, accountability comes in, and so people are able to actually point out where the things are going wrong. So this is it. And too much funding is also not healthy for the schools. Then funding transparency and equity is very much required. Then dedicated primary education governance, then community and local governance has to be emphasized. Variable-based funding models can be initiated, and some theoretical implications I have is this one. And then, Bhutan's primary education funding model governance is complex with transparency issue, and then establish dedicated governance division for primary education, and enhanced funding model that takes into the distinct needs of the schools, many variables. Some countries have as many as 19-20 variables for schools, based on which the funds are allocated. And enhanced community governance, and this is the future directions. I have set up a bold objective for my study, but I could not I could answer only partially the research question I set out for this study, and because of that, I provided them as future directions. I don't have reference. The research is there in this book, so I would request you to take the picture of that QR code and then get access to that book. So before concluding, I would like to thank the ambassador, Dr. Ambassador, Dr. VC, and the presidents, and also our distinguished guests from Australia, and also the participants here who have come to appreciate and celebrate the presentations that we have been making. And in the process, I would also like to acknowledge that the book is the idea that our president, Paro College President, Dr. Dorji Tinle, shared, came up with in one of the meetings, that the primary education, literature on primary education is scarce, and we needed to conduct research on the primary education system in Bhutan. So because of that idea, we were able to materialize this book. And side by side, the WVC, Royal University of Bhutan, has also been playing a very instrumental role in making the findings reach out to where they should be going. And recently we had the presentation made to the highest level at the Ministry of Education, and they appreciated very much as to the extent of trying to distribute a copy of the book to every school in Bhutan. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gembo, for sharing insights into the governance and financing of primary education in Bhutan, and also outlining the need for clearer resource distribution and dedicated division for primary education administration to strengthen equity, efficiency, and overall educational quality, and also for sharing the QR code of the booklet to the audience here. And with this, we move on to the next presentation, and for this, we have Kile Rinchen. Kile Rinchen is a PhD candidate at Edith Cowan University, studying the impact of COVID-19 in Bhutan. He completed his Master of Public Policy from Australian National University, postgraduate certificate in Development Management from the Royal Institute of Management, Bhutan, and BA in Geography Honours from Sherabsi College, Royal University of Bhutan. He was a Herbert Humphrey Fellow at Pennsylvania State University in the United States. Selected through the civil service examinations in 2002, Kile also served in this very office here at the Office of the Vice Chancellor at RUB for 18 years, after which he went to pursue his PhD. He also worked briefly as a transformation officer at His Majesty's Secretariat. During his time in Bhutan, Kile was deeply engaged in the formulation, implementation, and monitoring of plans of RUB, and conducted organizational development exercises in various agencies across the country. Currently, Kile works at Edith Cowan University as a casual lecturer, research officer, and as a student orientation advising and retention advisor. Please welcome Kili to speak on his topic, Reimagining Post-Pandemic Workplace Culture to Foster Psychological Well-Being in Bhutan.
Middle next. Okay. Thank you. Good morning and Kosa Sambola. My name is Kili Rinchen, currently a PhD candidate at Edith Cowan University, and I will be presenting on behalf of all the researchers. We have with me the researcher, Associate Professor Vicky Benham, who is here with us today, and Associate Professor Dr. Sonam Pede, who are both my supervisors also. Our topic today is reimagining post-pandemic workplace culture to foster psychological well-being in Bhutan. Can you share with me, by the show of your hand, how familiar you are with McKinsey's 7S model? 7S model. Looks like I have I'll give a try. If there are so many numbers, I would be more excited because then probably my audience base is larger. But anyway, let's try because it is relevant to each and every one of us. Let us look at briefly in terms of Bhutan's post-pandemic development journey, acknowledging the disruption, the unprecedented disruption on socio-economic well-being and psychosocial well-being. In the post-pandemic, right after pandemic has propelled Bhutan into a transformative era. We all know this very well, right? And as a result, we have come up with a new vision, developed Bhutan 2034. And sectors in pursuit of this vision has also come up their own goals, such as enlightened entrepreneurial bureaucracy, E2B, and 10x productivity, which was delivered quite clearly in the keynote speech by DHI CEO. The whole idea behind this is not to let ourselves slide back to pre-pandemic situation, but rather develop a new normal where we could surpass past limitations and based on the pandemic experiences. Drawing insights from these and looking into organizational culture, we have two objectives for this research: drawing lessons for the post-pandemic era and focusing on organizational culture and on psychological well-being. Again, drawing from the larger consensus in the literature that if you take care of the psychological well-being, definitely it will enhance engagement of the employees and also increase the innovation and productivity. On the other hand, if we are not able to take care of the psychological well-being, definitely it affects the productivity of the organization. It disengages people. In addition to this, we are also hopeful that this will also add to the larger discussions on promotion of overall well-being, which was discussed quite extensively yesterday. If we take care of the psychological well-being in the workplace, it will, because most of our time we spend in the workplace, if you do take care of the well-being in the workplace, it definitely matters a lot in overall well-being of individuals as well. So discussing about psychological well-being, we based the definition that psychological well-being refers to life going well with the combination of feeling good and functioning effectively. To draw further clarity, we looked at the parameters. And when we discussed the parameters, we drew from the models that discussed on indicators, dimensions, and parameters of psychological well-being. So from the three models, JNH Index, Renes, and Rives model, we identified positive emotions, environmental mastery, to give individuals an agency to take control and take charge of their own decisions, negative emotions, and meaningful relations, basically the social aspect. Again, based on the literature, we also identified that self-determination theory also addresses largely to address those issues, particularly if you take care of relatedness, autonomy, and competence. These are the three psychological needs based on the self-determination theory that would not only enhance psychological well-being, but also improve intrinsic motivation so that people would engage more meaningfully and purposefully at work. However, research in this area, and particularly in the context of Bhutan, and also in the context of post-pandemic reform, is lacking, and therefore it has motivated us to pursue in this space. It's a qualitative research, largely based on inter-method convergent design, drawing data from two sources, key informant interviews of 52 participants across diverse sectors, and also across the country, and based on published studies using Prisma framework. And we did reflexive thematic, Carls and Burns reflexive thematic analysis. A brief overview of the findings. So there was a consensus that psychological distress has been caused due to pandemic, and the primary cause is the uncertainty. So it is something that we need to address within the organizational context, how we remove uncertainty, if there is any, and it is the major cause. There was also work stress because of the need to embark on new activities, as well as learning new tools and new strategies. There was also restrictions on freedom affecting the autonomy. And one of the participants shared quite clearly that we realized the significance of freedom when it was taken away from us during the pandemic because of social restriction. But it also revealed some positive aspects of the workplace culture during pandemic, and that was actually addressing what many of the participants discussed yesterday and day before, the silo mentality. Pandemic actually brought us back to the fundamental needs of human beings, where we come together and then work towards a common purpose. So there was greater unity during the pandemic for all of us, breaking the silos. And then there was greater agility, both at the organizational level, at the individual level too. One of the participants shared that overnight, individuals learned technology and technological tools to provide undisrupted service in times of crisis. So that shows how agile we were at that time. Of course, then learning culture and commitment to undertake expanded responsibilities, primarily because of the shared purpose of protecting ourselves from the crisis, from the disease. It, however, exposed us some elements of poor workplace culture. I would like to draw your attention to the top three. Complacency. One of the participants put it quite clearly as K-me mentality. The English translation of it could be I don't care mentality or it doesn't matter mentality. And one of the participants even shared that even if we do wrong things deliberately, we would still go by this K-me mentality and we don't even care, thus showing the culture of empathy within our working system. There was, again, strong emphasis on hierarchy, thus leading to development of some participants put it as ego, some other participants put it as arrogance based on seniority. So as you become more senior, you tend to develop this, and thus affecting the engagement of all of the employees within the organization. And also leading to decisions based on seniority, not meritocracy. Thirdly, there was also, participants also shared about unhealthy competition within the organization, and that two things came out quite clearly. One is because of the competition, you would want to disregard what was done earlier, and you would do entirely a new thing that was there. And also within the unit and also across the unit, you would withhold information and not share. So these were some unhealthy practices that participants have observed during the pandemic. And that was actually sharing the workplace culture, the poor workplace culture across, and thus affecting the service delivery. Participants also shared about some of the lessons we can take from there to improve in the post-pandemic period, the lifelong learning, risk-taking because of the need of speedy decision-making during the pandemic and the crisis. There was some demonstrations of how decisions were made upfront, and clarity in the direction and focus, and seeing opportunities in crisis. There were some people who could see opportunities in times of crisis. And that has led to some transformation in the private sector, particularly. And the participants shared that as a result, in the new normal phase, they saw innovative businesses coming up, and thus requiring the decision makers and also the regulators to get up to the speed to be able to regulate and facilitate this environment. There also increasing demand on new work environments such as flexible work environment, remote work environment, collaborative learning and working environment, and so on. And emphasis on work life has also increased. Participants shared that not all have resigned to go to Australia. Some have resigned for work-life balance. So that was one quite crucial for us. And then, of course, priority on productivity and economy. But there were also challenges raised and concerns raised. And that is, not all are actually drawing from the experiences and insights of the learnings from COVID-19 pandemic. The memories are fading, and leadership was highlighted quite clearly. People were saying during the pandemic, right from the top, and even at the individual level, people have displayed selfless leadership and also compassionate leadership. But as soon as the pandemic ended, this was gone. And even the emphasis on well-being is thrown out of the window. I'm quoting them. There was also lack in terms of organizational focus in some cases, not really having a clarity between what individuals are doing and what organization would like to achieve. And then some elements, some signs of sliding back to risk-averse culture, which was also discussed yesterday, so I do not need to give the details in this area. Well, to summarize, to come back and get back and interpreting the data, we can see that in the new normal phase, in the post-pandemic phase, we need to now change the mindset. Again, changing mindset, Professor Amory highlighted very clearly in terms of having the right people with the right attitude, right mindset, right, during the fireside chat. So we definitely need to create this to be able to be more productive and efficient in our work, and also at the same time, the heightened emphasis of pandemic on psychological well-being does show that we need to also continue to work at this in the post-pandemic period. Unfortunately, there are also areas where we are not doing well in this front. Complacent attitude, again, as was already mentioned, withdrawing from the flexible work environment, particularly going back to pre-pandemic period, and also increased mistrust within the organizations, leading to affecting the psychological contract, and of course, the toxic work environment not being really addressed well enough, and leading to undermining psychological well-being, thus contributing to the high attrition rate at the moment. We then, based on this, propose changes to policies and practices, again, drawing on the self-determination theory in terms of enhancing competency, in terms of enhancing relatedness and autonomy, to look at how we can enhance individual competency, promoting lifelong learning in terms of continuously improving skills and knowledge, fostering trust in terms of relationship building, implement performance-based culture, moving from complacency to the culture of meritocracy, from KME mentality, eliminating KME mentality to the culture of meritocracy, and ensure transparency, a transparent leadership at all levels, so that there is greater level of fairness, equity, equality, and also transparency. And that we suggest to be implemented at all three levels, individual levels in terms of creating that environment, at the organizational level, creating a conducive environment and facilitating environment for the individuals to improve, and at the national level, looking at laws and policies to create and also to create that environment at the national level. One good example within Australia is that in the post-pandemic period, Australia has now identified psychological well-being equivalent to the physical safety and well-being. So that is one good example where we can look and learn from. So I would like to, in the interest of time, I would like to bring your, again, attention to the fourth one, to avoid repeating. Eliminate hostile work environments. If something that you would like to take away from this would be eliminating hostile work environment, to do this, we suggest that you do further research within the context of your own organizations, and also to identify drivers, because the needs and the environment would be unique in each organization. Look at drivers of hostile or toxic workplace environments and identify strategies to eliminate them, and also identify strategies to promote a positive workplace culture for better psychological well-being. If we are able to do that, if you're daring enough to do that, if you did this, we are sure that we will be able to enhance psychological well-being more, which would lead to better workplace engagement and also improve innovation, productivity, and we will contribute more effectively towards realizing the vision of developed Bhutan 2034, and of course contribute to the goal of enlightened entrepreneurial bureaucracy and 10x productivity goals. With this, thank you for your attention, and looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kile, for sharing your presentation on nurturing psychological well-being in workplace and for creating a supportive and resilient professional environments in Bhutan to inform the future organizational culture to realize the enlightened society. And it will be safe on my part to assume that this is a study that will not be just relevant to one organization, but almost in all organizations in Bhutan. And with this, we now come to our last speaker in this thematic session. And for this, we have Dr. Phuntsho Chodon, an independent consultant with a PhD from the Business School of Queensland University of Technology, where her research focused on social capital and well-being. With 2 decades of experience spanning civil service, academia, research, consulting, and evaluation, she brings a multidisciplinary perspective to her work. Dr. Phuntsho is a passionate advocate for research and evaluation, rooted in local wisdom and culturally responsive approaches. She currently serves as the chair of the Evaluation Association of Bhutan and is a member of the governance board of the Community of Evaluators South Asia and a founding member of Eval Youth Bhutan. Please welcome Dr. Phuntsho to speak on a topic, Evaluation Ecosystem, a Case of Bhutan.
Thank you. Kuzangpo, good morning, and it is a great pleasure for me and greatly honored to present my work on evaluation ecosystem of Bhutan, and this is the work based on the book chapter, the book titling Public Policy in the Global South, and this is co-authored with Mr. Tashi Dendup, who was the main instigator to submit this paper to this event, and he was supposed to be here to presenting this paper, but unfortunately he couldn't travel because of some important reason. He's based in Queensland, and with this, I would actually, I'm a bit nervous to be standing in front of all the academics here to make this presentation, looking at the values you have generated by being present here for the last 2 days. I'm really overwhelmed by the value production you have made to the research society. And with this, I would like to begin by saying that evaluation is a tool which really helps the decision making through generating evidence, which has already been really stated by Dashou Vice Chancellor in the opening statement here in the keynote speech, and that really energized me to go through this presentation as well. And I would also like to mention here that the presentation would be very brief. It is less rigor as compared to the other academic papers being presented here, But I would say that this is very important topic, practical, it has a lot of practical meaning, and also like in the globally, there is a debate on the evaluation to become a discipline by itself is getting more energy than before. So that's why I was thinking it is important to bring this to this forum of where you are, the meeting of all these thought leaders, innovators and researchers, and you could see some opportunities here. So with this, I would like to really state by saying that evaluation is a tool that really helps the decision making through generation of evidence, and to make this evaluation tool work, so we need an adequate ecosystem to thrive. So that's why for this presentation, I will be focusing more on the ecosystem of the evaluation rather than the evaluation as a tool. So, and also I would like to mention that the evaluation, in order to thrive this tool, you have to also really align well with the development principle in the practice at the national level. And so as you know that in Bhutan, our development is guided by GNH, and I don't need to dwell so much on this. You all are expert here more than me. And also I would like to state here that M&E has always been a priority. So monitoring and evaluation has always been a priority for the government. And since 2006, it has been gaining importance, and the first national monitoring and evaluation manual was introduced in 2006. And then the system has evolved over the years. Initially, it was placed under GNH Commission, and now it is looked after by Strategic Evaluation Division in the Office of Cabinet Affairs and Strategic Coordination, and the monitoring part is placed with the Ministry of Finance. So the evaluation, M&E has been gaining importance, and as you see, like in Bhutan, the monitoring has been thriving. It has been doing very well. And I think like everyone knows about monitoring, discuss a lot about monitoring, but when it comes to the evaluation, it still remains at a formative stage. So in a way that it is so important to look at what is happening here, and what are some institutions that are proposing evaluation to thrive, and also like what are some processes involved. So in that way, we started doing this work on by asking what this prevailing ecosystem that is prevail in the government system, how it draws on the GNH to tell us what is going right and what is not, which is the function of evaluation, and also to see what contribution can be made in promoting the evaluation that is relevant to the development principle practice in Bhutan. So with this, we mainly aimed to document the existing institution and the system and the processes, and the evolution of evaluation in Bhutan, and to examine the current institutional structure and the processes guiding the evaluation, and to look into future and to identify challenges, opportunities for strengthening this evaluation ecosystem, and ultimately to contribute to the localization of evaluation based on the principle of development we follow in Bhutan. So with this, we looked at the literature, existing literature, and when we review the literature, so there is none on Bhutan's context, especially focusing on this evaluation ecosystem, which could be a gap, and where institutions like yourself could come in. And based on the literature available and the current practice, we came up with this theoretical framework for our work. So in how we have seen for creating a vibrant evaluation ecosystem, there are a few active agents, like important agents. One, on the one side, the demand for evaluation has to be, that play a very important role in creating the vibrant evaluation ecosystem. So demand for evaluation comes from the government agencies and CSOs, the development partners and funders. These are the main actors on the demand side. And again, when we talk about the demand, there has to also the supply side, right? So this should come together to determine the integration of this to take place. So on the supply side, the role of like universities, training institutions, and evaluation agencies. There are many voluntary organization, professional evaluation organization, both in the country as well as regional at the global level. So they have a very important role in producing in the supply of evaluation expert, especially the role of universities, training institutions comes here. And also, like when this demand side and the supply side integrates, and then there is a continuous production of the evidence for decision making, and as well as when there is a practice of evaluation happening in the society, then this really strengthens the evaluation capacity with the evaluators as well. So this is the kind of theoretical framework we have developed based on the literature as well as the practice happening within in Bhutan as well as elsewhere in the regional at the global level, how the evaluation ecosystem is being developed. So where the supply and the demand for evaluation and the institution play a very important role. And most important thing here, I would like to focus on setting the legal context for MNE to thrive. So where like government should come in to set the context, develop the required standards, even the national framework of competency that will really guide the evaluators in practice. So these are things, and with this, I would like to go to the methodology. So here we have followed the DAX review. It's a very simple approach we took, and we reviewed the national policy, evaluation manual, government reports, and also we had the access to secondary report of Evaluation Association of Bhutan, which is a CSO promoting evaluation culture in Bhutan. And based on the review of relevant literature, including the evaluation framework, capacity building reports, and then we have found out that at the national level, including the Constitution and the Local Government Act provides for the MNE system. But at the practical level, the enabling environment supporting the practice of evaluation is totally missing. There is no standard, there is no manual to guide the evaluators, there is no competency framework for the evaluators to follow, and there is lack of institution that provide the program and the capacity skill development program on the supply side, and limited demand for the evaluation that really does not encourage the skill development, and public discourse on evaluation is very much limited and often confused with monitoring. So when we talk about evaluation, everyone thinks that monitoring is done, then evaluation is done. This is totally, they are closely related, but they operate at a different level. For example, for an intervention, for a development intervention, if you want to look at the output, then monitoring can do that. But if you really if you really want to look into the change that brings, outcome level, impact level, then monitoring has limitation and evaluation has to come in. So here, these two are not well differentiated and they are confused about these two concepts. And they